welcome to part two of the Tug Hill Winter Wildlife webinar series. We'll have two more webinars following this in March and April. Tonight's webinar, following the Fisher webinar in January, is entitled "On the Doorstep: Could American Martens Recolonize Tug Hill?" And we're grateful to be partnering with the Department of Environmental Conservation again on tonight's webinar. And your speaker is going to be Paul Jensen, who I'll introduce a little more about in a couple of minutes. I'll keep my introduction a little shorter than last time, since I think a lot of you may have joined for our last webinar in the series. Please use the chat function for any questions that you have throughout tonight's presentation. You're all automatically on mute, and we'll get to your questions mostly at the end unless otherwise necessary, but we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So a little bit about the Tug Hill Commission to keep it short. The New York State Tug Hill Commission is a small, non-regulatory state agency charged with helping local governments and citizens shape the future of the Tug Hill region. One of our key program areas is natural resources, where we aim to help local people and partners to protect the sprawling forests, wetlands, and other natural features of Tug Hill. And our hope is that tonight you'll learn a little more about the American marten and gain some knowledge and appreciation for other species and ecosystems on Tug Hill. And for tonight's talk, a little bit more about the Adirondack and the area in between as well. Bear with me as I get to our next slide. So our next webinar is going to be about Tug Hill birds, and that'll be on March 12th at 6 p.m. So join Irene Mazzocchi, a recently retired Region 6 DC wildlife biologist, and Linda Gibbs, who's the Community Programs Director for Tug Hill Tomorrow Land Trust, for a lesson on Tug Hill birds. They'll talk about bird identification, population trends, habitat protection efforts, ways to help birds every day, and point us towards some ways we can help with citizen science programs, especially concerning birds on Tug Hill. On the left, you have a pileated woodpecker submitted to the Tug Hill Tomorrow Land Trust 2024 calendar by Tyler Clemens in New Bremen. And you'll receive more information about that in the follow-up email for tonight's webinar as well. And I'll also make a quick note about another partnership that the Tug Hill Commission is involved in. Tonight you'll hear a little bit about wildlife connectivity between Tug Hill and the Adirondacks as well. So I'll just highlight the Tug Hill's Commission's involvement in the Staying Connected initiative. It's a program led by the Nature Conservancy, and the note on the right has a little bit about the initiative. It focuses on many linkages, but the Tug Hill Adirondacks linkage is the one we're most focused on, obviously. Between New York's Adirondack Park and Tug Hill region lays the Black River Valley. The southern portion of the valley stands out as a natural funnel for wildlife, a largely forested stretch of land surrounded by agricultural and residential areas. Wide-ranging species like black bear, bobcat currently use the valley as a corridor to move between the Adirondacks and Tug Hill, and once extirpated species like moose and marten are beginning to return to the area. By partnering with local leaders and community members, important wildlife habitat is being conserved and innovative solutions are being implemented to remove barriers to wildlife movement. And I look forward to hearing Paul touch on those topics a little more. And I encourage you to visit the Staying Connected Initiative website if you'd like to learn more about that. They have some very interactive story maps and other materials. So without further ado, I'll introduce Paul Jensen. Paul Jensen is a regional wildlife program manager with the New York State DC Division of Fish and Wildlife in Region 5, where he directs research, survey, and land management projects in the Adirondacks and Lake Champlain Basin. Previously, he was the fur bearer biologist for the region for 14 years, where his research focused on the ecology and management of American martens and fishers. Prior to joining New York State, DC in 2003, he worked in Alaska, where he was involved with long-term monitoring of caribou and waterfowl populations on the Arctic coastal plain, and conducted research with the New York Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at Cornell University. Paul is currently adjunct faculty in the Department of Environmental Biology at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and a research fellow with the Natural Sciences Department at Paul Smith College. Paul received his BS in Environmental and Forest Biology from SUNY ESF, MS in Wildlife Ecology from the University of New Hampshire, and PhD in Wildlife Biology from McGill University. So thank you again, Paul, and I will hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Gabriel. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Are you able to see that?
Not yet.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay.
And Paul, could you speak up a little bit? I'm having a little bit of a hard time hearing you.
Okay. Yep, I will speak up. Is that better?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Gabriel
And Paul, real quick, sorry to interrupt, but you're still on, you're not on presenter mode yet.
Oh, okay. Am I on my, let's see here. Sorry about that. Is that better?
Yep. It's not full screen.
All right, let me see here.
Looks okay on my end.
All right, yeah, that'll definitely work then.
Okay. It's just not full screen.
Yeah, other than that, we can't see your notes or anything, so.
All right. Okay. We'll run with this. So yes, thanks, Gabriel. Thank you, Jennifer, for inviting me tonight. It's always good to talk about martens. If I'm being honest, I do feel a little bit awkward talking about an area in Region 6, which is Tug Hill. So I just wanted to give credit where credit is due and say that, I've worked many years with my colleagues in Region 6, in particular, Andy McDuff and Tim Basinski, Jim, and really their contributions to this have been substantial, either through field work or just through discussions and helping me to clarify, my thinking. They obviously are stationed right there and know much more about the Tug Hill than I do. But I've always been really interested in the Tug Hill. Obviously, it's legendary from the perspective of lake effect storms. And so the area has always intrigued me. So it's been really interesting to work on this project, which really I started several years ago. And a lot of the research that I was doing in the Adirondacks were applicable to better understanding whether or not martens could recolonize the Tug Hill. So good evening, everyone. I think we got a good participation tonight, and so that's encouraging. And I just wanted to say, if you attended the last seminar in this series, which was given by Tim Basinski, who is the DEC Region 6 biologist, you'll know that he spoke on fishery ecology and management. And so he teed me up nicely with his last slide to talk about American martens tonight. So my assignment that's before me now is really to explore the idea of whether martens could successfully recolonize the Tug Hill region. And over the years, I've gotten a lot of questions about this and a lot of interest. some from folks that live on the Tug Hill, others from outside the area. But tonight I'm going to share with you some of the results of the research that I've been involved with the DEC Bureau of Wildlife over several years. And I'm going to present some evidence that I hope sheds some light on this issue. And the last thing I was going to say is that this may be a spoiler, but I'm sure it doesn't come to a surprise of anyone that by the end of this presentation, there may be more questions than answers. And I don't think that will be a shock, given that oftentimes this is the very nature of science. And so we've learned a lot, but I think we have a lot to learn. And a lot of this we won't find out until things start changing more rapidly. So with that brief intro, let's jump into the presentation. And let me see if I can advance my slide. There we go. So tonight we're going to talk about several things. First of all, we'll jump into the biology and ecology of martens. We'll go through some of the history, what happened to martens and where do we have them currently? What's their current distribution? What's their historical distribution? I'll then go into some of our research, and some of that research was based upon data that the department collected as part of a harvest monitoring program for marten. And so both martens and fishers are species that are trapped in New York State. It's a highly regulated trapping season, and we closely monitor it. And we've learned a lot from the data that we've collected from trappers. So part of it will be harvest based, and then another part will be based upon field research that we've completed. And then I sort of want to take that whole ball of wax and attempt to synthesize it and draw some conclusions. And then lastly, I want to jump into some future work that may help us to continue to monitor this and other wildlife species in the Tug Hill and in the Adirondacks. So let's first start with some of the biology and ecology. Martens are fairly small. They're in the mustelid family. They're much smaller than a fisher. They're closely related to a fisher, although they're much smaller, about 1 to 2 pounds. So typically a female is about a pound or a little less than a pound, where a male is about 2 pounds. They have this orange, sort of an orange golden color fur, a very white head, very large ears, and you can't see it in this photo, but a very prominent throat patch, which is unique to individuals. They're a habitat specialist, and so they require a forest. They require connected forest and large expanses of connected forest. And they also utilize structurally complex habitats. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. Although they're habitat specialists, they're dietary generalists. So both martens and fishers are pretty much walking stomachs. They're constantly foraging, and they will literally eat just about anything. There's a lot of variation seasonally in their prey and in their food items, but their prey consists of anything from small mammals, and small mammals may constitute up to 40 to 50% of their diet in the winter, as well as hares. There's many researchers that believe that martens really specialize on hunting hares and sort of eat things in between those hunting bouts. But they'll also eat a lot of other things. So they're not obligate carnivores. They also eat nuts and berries. Even in the summertime, they'll eat insects. So they'll dig up, hornets' nests or wasp nests and eat the larvae, eat the adults. So again, pretty much they'll eat anything. And they have this really interesting behavior. In the wintertime, they can actually tunnel down. They'll use a break in the top of the snow, and they'll tunnel down underneath the snow and exploit what's known as the subnivean space, which is that space between the forest floor and where there's any kind of woody debris, stumps, branches, anything that's down on that forest floor that's creating those dead air spaces. Those are the areas where the small mammals overwinter, and martens can successfully exploit that space. A lot of the other larger carnivores can't. And so martens do very well in places that have very harsh winters, deep snowpack, and also are low productivity systems with low prey abundance and low prey diversity. Because what those things do, and this is sort of another spoiler alert, is that what those things do is they limit the populations of all the other competing carnivores that not only compete with them for food, but also will prey on them. So let's talk about structural complexity of forests. Essentially, when it comes to marten habitat, structurally complex forests are key because this structure is tied into all aspects of their natural history. So everything from escaping predators to thermal regulation, rearing young, finding food, all aspects of their life history are tied into this structure. So you can imagine, for example, this looks like a spruce here, maybe a red spruce. I can't really tell if it's a balsam fir or red spruce. You can imagine that these are important areas for marten to rest in the canopy, and oftentimes in the winter they'll be resting up in this canopy. You can imagine how difficult it would be for a bird of prey to come swooping into this complex structure and attack a marten. Another thing that we can think about is closed canopies. So if you look down here, closed canopies are really important. Why? Because it's a means of escape for all the other carnivores that are out to kill them. So species like coyotes and fishers and bobcats and fox. And so what this allows a marten to do is that if they're foraging somewhere on the forest floor and all of a sudden they detect another animal that is going to attack them, they can climb up and escape that predator in the tree. And even for other predators that can climb trees, like bobcats, like fishers, like gray fox, they can escape those animals by moving across the canopy. And on several occasions where I've had radio collared martens that I've tracked to resting areas, I've watched them move across the canopy just as quickly as they can run on the ground. So it's quite amazing. And then lastly, another thing that I just mentioned was this subnivean zone. So you can imagine that this white line right here is the top of the snowpack. And then all of this coarse woody debris, these down trees, these branches are covered up with snow. But what happens is, again, these dead air spaces are formed underneath this coarse woody debris. And so a marten comes along on the top of this snow, and maybe there's a break in the snow along this tree trunk, and small mammals are using that to get down into the subnivean zone. And so that marten stops there. It smells at the top of that hole that, okay, there's some goodies down below that they want to munch on. And so then they go down through that access hole, and then they hunt these subnivean spaces down here. Again, other larger carnivores can't do that. So they can exploit a food base that other carnivores can't. The exception would be like a long-tailed weasel or short-tailed weasel could do similar hunting, but martens will also prey on weasels. So there's some competitive relationships there as well. So when we talk about forests and what types of forests do marten prefer, they're really quite general in terms of the types of forests that they select. Again, the key thing is, do the forest stands that are present have the requisite structure to support marten? And so the composition isn't as important as the structural attributes. And in many cases, although not always, older forests, so we're talking about either mature second growth or old growth forests, have that high structural complexity that martens need. That doesn't mean that some level of timber harvesting will preclude their presence, because it won't. But if there's enough forest cover to allow for passage of martens between and among forest stands, and again, the structure is there, they can persist in forests that are being harvested. And that's been shown throughout pretty much anywhere in their geographic range. But there are some forests in New York State that I would consider the gold standard. The high peaks in the Adirondacks are an area where we probably have our highest marten densities. And it's because the habitat is very suitable for marten in terms of connectivity and the structural attributes, but it's also a low productivity environment with very severe winters that limits the distribution and the density of other competing carnivores. So just to give you some examples, however, I try to dispel the myth that this is the only type of habitat where you'll find marten, because I've talked with many people where they're thinking and where they're at and their understanding is that, oh, it's got to be high elevation spruce fir habitat, and that's patently false. They'll occur in sort of these transitional hardwood conifer stands and forests. The southern Adirondacks, when we started to do some research in this area, we were surprised at how many martens that we found either in our surveys or in our live trapping. This area right here is from the West Canada Lakes region, which is again, it's very close to the Tug Hill. And from the pictures I've seen, a lot of the forests in the Tug Hill look very similar to this. They're a mix of deciduous and coniferous forests. But surprisingly, what we found too, when we started to collar and track martens, is that some of these animals were using home ranges that had a very high proportion of deciduous trees in them. So some of the home ranges of the martens that we had collared had up to 95% deciduous forest. And so that was very surprising to us, because everything in the literature suggested that, they absolutely require some level of coniferous forest. The kits are born in April and May, litter size of 2 to 3, again, very similar to Fisher. Their home ranges are about 1 to 2 square miles. So again, females having the smaller home ranges of about 1 square mile, males 2 square miles, or excuse me, 1 to 2 for females, 2 to 6 for males. They're intersexually territorial. So males will tolerate females, females will tolerate males, but they don't tolerate the same sex. So many times what you have is a male with several non-overlapping female home ranges within his home range. And those home ranges may not seem huge to you, but per unit of body mass, they're some of the largest home ranges of any of the terrestrial mammals. And their occurrence in New York is restricted to the central Adirondacks. So it's a geographically isolated population. There is no, connectivity or gene flow to other areas of the Northeast or adjacent Canada. We can talk more about that later, but historically they occurred throughout the entire state. So we'll talk why did that population get restricted. I'm just going to quickly, because Tim sort of left his presentation with marten, I'm going to just talk very briefly about Fisher, because they are one of the main competitors and predators of martens. So we'll just talk a little bit about the ecology of of Fishers. They're much bigger than a marten, up to 15 pounds. Even some of the males will get even up to 20 pounds. In the same family, the mustelid or weasel family. Similar to martens, they're a dietary generalist, and again, they'll pretty much eat anything. Their body size really precludes them from exploiting that subnivean zone. And again, this is sort of some of the thinking of why there is at least some partitioning between martens and fishers, in that, again, martens can exploit those deep snowpack areas where fishers really can't. And that's especially true in places where prey abundance and diversity are low. However, they do have very high dietary overlap with coyotes. And so they're really, in the wintertime in the northern part of New York, they're very much focused on snowshoe hares and also eating carrion, or basically dead deer that succumb either to severe winters or through coyote predation. So they will scavenge other kills of other carnivores. Kits are born earlier than kits of marten, March, April, and litter size is pretty much the same. And again, large home ranges, those 12 to 15 square mile, that's 12 to 15 square mile estimate for males is probably on the low side for fishers in the Adirondacks. We documented home ranges of 20 to 40 square miles. So fairly large, suggesting that fishers in the central Adirondacks are at low densities. They're also territorial. They pretty much have a statewide distribution at this point, and few predators. Coyotes, bobcats, and eagles are some of their predators. And again, they occur together or sympatrically with martens in the central Adirondacks, where they will prey on marten and compete for the same prey and food resources, which is called inter-guild predation. So one of the things that, you know, I hope you can appreciate as we talk further about marten is that this system is very complex. And I don't want to suggest otherwise. It is exceedingly difficult to tease apart these relationships, but what you have going on simultaneously are what are called top-down influences on the marten population through other predators that, again, are competing with them for food, the same food base, which you can see on the right. And at the same time, there's these relationships that occur between and among one another, where the larger carnivores attempt to prey and kill the smaller carnivores. And so there's always a risk in doing that. You know, that does not come without risk. If a fisher decides to attack a marten, it may, it may have a life-threatening injury from that marten, and ultimately it may die. And so when it makes that decision to attack a marten, it's because there's a benefit to be gained from that. The first benefit is that by killing the marten, it's reducing an animal that's directly competing with it. And in this case, it's probably because fishers also rely heavily on snowshoe hare. But because marten can exploit the small mammals in that subnivean zone, they can switch between small mammals and hares. And so there's a lot to be gained for fishers to reduce that competition with martens. And then the side benefit is that they can then consume the marten as well. But the benefit of reducing competition is really king. So lots of interactions that are occurring within this wildlife community among these various carnivores, all of them really competing for a limited set of prey and food items. And then on top of that, and really sort of not really on top, but at the base, are what's called the abiotic conditions of the environment. So what's the snowpack like? What's the temperature like? All of these things affect both the energy expenditure of the animal. They affect the ability of animals to acquire energy, and they just have very pervasive effects in these systems. So very, very complex, but we're learning, and we have learned about some of these dynamics, and I'm going to share some of these things tonight. And I just forgot to mention too, that a lot of this is driven, at least some of these food dynamics are driven by forest tree seed crops or mast. So you can think of species like American beech that produces beech nuts, or American mountain ash that produces berries. These are two food sources that martens take advantage of quite readily. And also spruce cone crops. So spruce cone crops also influence small mammal population dynamics. So you have these trees that are producing seeds, influencing these small mammal populations influencing the predator populations. All that to say, very, very complex system with both top-down effects from the carnivores and bottom-up effects by the food sources and the environment and the abiotic conditions that mediate and change these relationships depending upon the conditions. So with that, just wanted to talk a little bit about the geographic range of martens and fishers in North America. Both of these species are widely distributed, mostly in Canada and mostly within the boreal forest of Canada and Alaska. You do see places both in the Midwest and the Northeast where both martens and fishers extend into. And so what you see here in this figure, in the green those are populations of marten. The yellow are areas that fishers occur in, and then places where they both occur is green. And then marten populations are blue up here. So in the more northern areas, there's no fisher. The southern band here is green. That's where martens and fishers coexist or co-occur. And the yellow is where you just have fishers. So in much of the Northeast, we have very robust fisher populations and only disjunct, really for the most part, disjunct marten populations that occur like right here in the Adirondacks, and even this population south of the St. Lawrence River in northern Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire, New Brunswick. This population, in fact, is disjunct from most of the population in North America because you have the St. Lawrence River and the St. Lawrence River estuary right here. But the last thing I wanted to show you with this figure is the historical southern range of these species. So if you look at historically, so this would be like pre-colonial times, martens occurred much further south. In fact, they occurred down into northern Pennsylvania and covered probably all of New York State and most of New England, except for maybe the seacoast area. Fishers also extended more to the south, all the way down into the northeastern corner of Tennessee. And there's a very small population that still persists in this area. But the difference is that fishers pretty much recolonized much of their historical range. So what we have now is really almost what we had historically, but that's not the case with marten. With marten, that southern limit of their range has been shifted northward, and now we have populations just in the northern part of the northeastern U.S. and the Midwest. So, what happened here? Well, it's a common history with a lot of species that used to occur in New York State. So we had a pre-colonial distribution of a whole suite of species that either we don't have now or just occur just occasionally as dispersers. So species like marten, fisher, bobcat, mountain lions, Canada lynx, wolves, and moose. Of these species, mountain lions do not occur in New York State anymore. Canada lynx, we occasionally get dispersers, and pretty much the same with wolves. Moose, on the other hand, have made a comeback. We can talk more about moose later. But really what led to the demise of these species, as far as we can tell from the historical record, are a number of things. Three in particular. One, unregulated or liberal hunting and trapping seasons. And so this was a time before modern wildlife management principles were in place. And so these seasons were really, they were very liberal. They were really not enforced at all or poorly enforced. And so people pretty much took as many as they wanted. I've looked at some of the historical harvests in the Adirondacks, and they're, 3-4 times what we typically harvest in a given year nowadays. There was also bounties. There was never, at least from what I've gained in my reading, there never was a bounty for marten, but some of these other predators there were. So, for example, bobcats had a bounty on them, and mountain lions had a bounty on them as well. And so I imagine some of these other species fell victim to trappers out looking to gain bounties for these other species. And then lastly, landscape changes. Pre-colonial distribution, the landscape changed radically. It went from being primarily forested to an agricultural landscape. And so large areas were cut. Of course, in the Adirondacks, you had many of these areas that burned afterwards. A lot of fires that were caused by railroads that were put in, and very large-scale fires that greatly reduced the amount of habitat for many of these species. So just quickly, a sort of a marten timeline. So again, pre-colonial, they occurred throughout the entire state. By the mid to late 1800s, martens occurred only in the Catskills and in the Adirondacks. By the early 1900s, they were just in the Adirondacks. By the 1930s, that population shrunk down even further to just being within the High Peaks region, which really was a testament to the remote nature of the High Peaks and the fact that it was very difficult to log that area. And secondly, it was very difficult to access. So it was a sort of like a refugia for marten. In 1936, New York State closed the trapping season. And then between about 1936 and 1997, that population slowly started to recover and regain its former range. And by 1978, the department felt like it had enough information, enough data to reopen the marten trapping season in a very limited area, again, just within the High Peaks. And so that occurred. And really the history between 1978 and 2010 is that population continued to expand throughout its historical range. And the department gradually and incrementally increased the area by which we allow trappers to harvest martens on a sustainable basis. Now, from all the data that I've looked at, it appears to me, and I won't go into some of the reasons, but through our intensive harvest monitoring, it appears to me that our population right now is pretty much at a maximum in terms of where it's located geographically. They're pretty much throughout all of the Adirondacks, but there definitely is some spatial structure to this population, and we'll cover that here momentarily. I just wanted to show you when I first started as a biologist, this was a hand-drawn map that I found. So a very crude estimate, but actually was not a bad estimate for really where the core marten range is. Again, this shows that High Peaks region as being that red area where we had our highest densities at the time. And I don't have a date for this map. My guess would be maybe in the 1960s, maybe 1970. But really prior to the department having at its disposal some more modern tools like, geographic information systems where we can collect spatially explicit data and map it. And so again, very, very crude estimates of range. There's some papers between 1958 and 1986 that again tracked the expansion of the marten population during this time. And again, very crudely estimated, okay, where do we have marten, and where do we have core areas where densities are higher than in other areas. And so again, that High Peaks region, a central Adirondacks was identified. at least at this time in the mid 1950s, as sort of the area that had most of our marten. Now, over the years, and through not only sort of collecting and mapping historical data, but also developing a harvest monitoring program, we started to really hone in and better understand marten distribution in the Adirondacks. And so these data were collected between 1978 and 2015. Many of these data collected from about 2005 to 2015 have very precise locations associated with those harvest records, as well as other important information like sex and age of the animal. And so we've just been able to learn a tremendous amount about our population from these records. And so one of the things I would just mention real quickly is, the title of my talk is On the Doorstep. And as you can see, the reason why I titled my talk that way is because these martens out here are literally right on the doorstep with Tug Hill. And in fact, we had two occurrences out here, one in the city of Rome, where we had a marten that was killed by a vehicle and somebody ran it over. And then another one out here that I believe maybe a trapper was trapping for fisher and trapped this animal. This is out by Oneida Lake. And so we are getting successful dispersers coming out of the Adirondacks. And so we'll cover again this question, what's going on with those dispersers? Are they surviving? And will we someday have a population on the Tug Hill? But these data really helped us to, again, not only define the distribution, but then to start asking questions of the data. Why are they only distributed in the central Adirondack region? What is it about this distribution that's really constraining these animals, or what are the environmental factors that are constraining this population in the Adirondacks? So from these data, we started to construct what are called resource selection probability functions. They're basically predictions of habitat suitability. And I was really, interested in what were those environmental variables that were constraining marten. So one of the variables that I included in the model was the probability of a fisher use of the area. And so I had very similar harvest location data for fisher. And with those data, I was able to generate this habitat suitability map of predicted probability of fisher use. And then I used this as a variable in my marten model. And so what we found was that the probability of fisher use was related primarily to March temperature in a positive way. So the warmer it was in March, the greater the probability that fishers would use that area. And so we have, what you can see from this map is a very high probability of fisher use in the peripheral areas out here and on the Tug Hill, and much lower probabilities in the central Adirondacks. Now, it wasn't just temperature, it was also percent conifer, which was likely related to the presence of one of their primary prey items, which is snowshoe hare, negatively related to coyote abundance, and surprisingly positively related to March snowpack. But what this revealed too is that, not really revealed, but what I had inferred is that because fishers are generalist carnivores, I believe that many of our other generalist carnivores follow a similar pattern, and some of our survey data bear that out. So these areas where we have high probability of fisher use are also areas where we have more abundant coyote populations, more abundant fox populations, more bobcats, and all these species likely, in a collective manner, have a large impact on marten populations. But what we found was that when we constructed the marten models, that the probability of marten use was strongly related to the probability of fishers being in that area. And so you can see that these predicted probabilities where you have really high probabilities of marten in the central Adirondacks are almost, you know, the inverse of fisher. So there's fisher, there's marten. They're not perfect, but they're pretty close. The probability of marten use was also related to some other factors, but the probability of fisher use was one of the strongest predictors. So places where the probability of fishers was high resulted in a low probability of marten use. And so we can see that again out in the, especially out in this peripheral area where probability of marten is very, very low. And really the same thing here on the Tug Hill. We have some higher probabilities in this section of the Tug Hill, but still relatively low. What was interesting was that I took this map and this area here, this red area, I converted it into really a binary variable. So that was the place, those were the places that the model predicted martens would occur on the landscape. And then I plotted the locations that I used to create this model. I plotted them back onto that map, but this time I demarcated whether or not those animals were adult or juveniles. And so we see in this area where we predict marten to occur, a nice mix of adult marten and juvenile marten. But what we find out on the peripheral areas is that most of these animals are juveniles. And so these data were collected over many years, which from that I inferred that martens were successfully dispersing out of this core area, but they weren't surviving. And the reason why I could make that inference was because that the number of adult martens that we were detecting in these peripheral areas over many years was very, very low. And you can see them, I mean, you can almost count them on one hand, how few of these are actually adult martens versus juveniles. And again, why is that the case? Well, it's because fishers and other generalist carnivores occur at higher densities in these areas. So these juvenile martens, at least what I'm inferring from these data, is that these juvenile martens are dispersing out of this core, but they're not surviving, and they're not surviving because they're both competing with these other carnivores and they're being preyed on by these other carnivores. The other interesting thing that we found in the Adirondacks is that martens are very much tied in, and fishers to a lesser degree, but martens are very much tied into these mast crops. And so we see these regular cycles when these trees produce mast, and in particular, I'm talking about American beech and mountain ash because these are very important food sources for marten. But they have years where there's high production, and then followed by years when there's very low production or a complete failure. And what we found was that the harvest vulnerability of martens, their movements, their space use as reflected in home range size, their age structure, and their dispersal is very much tied into these cycles. And so with this last point of dispersal, what we found was that the years where we're getting these juveniles dispersing out of this core and into these peripheral areas are years when the mast fails. And so there's very little food on the landscape, and these juveniles disperse over great distances and eventually make their way out of this core region and into these peripheral areas. Again, the problem is that they're not surviving. Now, in years where there's a lot of mast being produced, very, very few animals are harvested in these peripheral areas. These two locations out here that I mentioned, the one in Rome and the one over here by Oneida Lake, both of these were in 2014, and that was a mass failure year, which you would expect. But again, these were probably some of the largest dispersal events out of the data that we have, and occurred, quite a ways outside the cluster of data in the southwestern Adirondacks here. So Jumping to our non-invasive surveys. Just checking the time here. Jumping to our non-invasive surveys. So I just presented the harvest data. What we decided to do was some follow-up surveys. It was mostly because we had some concerns with fisher populations. And so we set out to really get a better idea of fisher distribution throughout the northern zone and see if we could better understand maybe what was occurring with the fisher population and why in some areas it seemed to be declining, in other areas it didn't. And so regions 5 and 6 partners, so Andy McDuff and Tim Pazinski and my fur bearer biologist, Tim Watson, we really sort of joined forces and we worked over this very large scale. We set out approximately 200 cameras in 200 sample units. So there was a single camera trap or trail camera within those sample units. And we pretty much just blanketed the Adirondack region and the Tug Hill region. And we use a designed approach, so it wasn't just haphazard. It was a randomized design. The surveys were 3-week surveys, again with the purpose to detect primarily fisher and marten. But the great thing about these camera traps is that you also pick up other critters, and in particular with the methods that we were using, we were picking up other carnivores like coyotes. So this map here shows you our marten detections from these carnivore surveys. So what you see in red, all those red locations or red dots are places where we did not detect a marten from between 2016 and 2018. So those would have been 3 years and 3-week surveys in each one of those years. So quite a bit of effort. What we found was that not surprisingly, most of the marten detections, about 90%, occurred within this same area. And this polygon here, this polygon represents the 95% kernel density estimate of all of our harvest locations between 1978 and 2015. So not surprisingly, our surveys confirm that yes, this is indeed where most of our marten are in the central Adirondack region. But again, the surveys did note some areas where we had martens relatively close to the Tug Hill. We then took these data and we used a different type of model. They're called occupancy models. And with our partners at Cornell University, we did very similar modeling where we were looking at the probability of occupancy, slightly different from my resource selection models, but you can think about them in the same way. They're reflective of habitat suitability, or at least that's what we're assuming. And in this case, we saw some similarities, but this model really highlighted that snowpack was the most important feature for marten, and that martens were positively associated with snowpack. So the deeper the snowpack, the greater probability of occupancy. Now, so when we look at both of these models, the most important thing I can say is that I can share this quote from George Box, who is a statistician. And he said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so I'm not going to say that one model is better or more correct than the other, because they're both abstractions of reality and simplifications of reality. And it's interesting because although we use different data and different modeling frameworks, one effort, the occupancy models use survey data, the resource selection functions use harvest data, but they both landed in similar space in that abiotic conditions were driving these distributions. In the case of the survey data and the occupancy model, it was a direct linkage to snowpack, snow depth. In the case of the resource selection models, it was indirectly. So temperature was influencing fisher populations very strongly, and then fisher populations were then influencing marten populations. So across the board, it seems like abiotic conditions are the most important factors that mediate these relationships. And again, that's not only important for fisher, but I think that can be generalized somewhat to other carnivores and their role in these dynamics. So some of the similarities with these models, both predicted high levels of occupancy and probability in the central Adirondacks. One of the notable differences, though, is with the Tug Hill. In this model here, they noted very high probabilities for marten. So this is predicted probability, where my model predicted lower probabilities here. But interestingly, it sort of identified a very similar space right here, somewhat more of the eastern side of the Tug Hill, not the western. And so that highlights some uncertainties. And again, with Tug Hill, it leads us to sort of ask some additional questions. So if we look at the resource selection probability function, and we sort of zoom in on that some more, we can see these areas where, again, the model didn't really predict that marten would occur here. These probabilities are relatively low, but still fairly substantial locations. And again, very close to areas where we've had martens trapped in this area down here. So when we take this away, we can look at sort of these polygons in a little bit closer detail relative to forest cover. And again, these are fairly substantial areas. This red polygon is about 22,000 acres. This bigger black area, about 133,000 acres. From the standpoint of the home ranges, though, that I presented early on, probably if martens could exist there, the population undoubtedly would be small. So the next thing kind of like wanted to look at and explore is this potential landscape linkage between the Adirondacks and Tug Hill. And if you look at the forest composition in here and the connectivity, again, it's mostly deciduous forest. There's some coniferous cover in here. That's probably not as big of a deal as the fact that there are some breaks in connectivity, right? So we see these larger areas that are most likely agricultural fields or regenerating forests. Some of them could possibly be wetlands that were confused with regenerating forest. But you do see some issues that become apparent in terms of connectivity that would maintain a population between the Adirondacks and the Tug Hill. But this level of connectivity, I think, would be adequate for to basically promote dispersal of marten between these two regions. One of the reasons I think I can say that is we know that there were at least 2 successful dispersal events all the way out in these areas here, all the way down into Rome through probably some inhospitable habitat and all the way out in this area here north of Oneida Lake. So synthesis and conclusions. Again, I probably am not going to have very solid conclusions that may satisfy your minds, but based upon our models, I feel that the likelihood of marten dispersal to the Tug Hill is high. And again, one could argue that it's already occurred in the southern part and in the peripheral areas like Forestport. The issue becomes, what will the subsequent survival of those dispersers be? And there's a great deal of uncertainty surrounding that. Based upon our previous data, I would say, at least under the conditions that we have now, survival of those dispersers would probably be very, very low, because it would most likely be very similar to that southwestern area of the Adirondacks where we have all those juveniles, but very few adults. Another question is, are the structural attributes of Tug Hill Forest adequate for the long-term persistence of marten populations? How will climate and land use changes influence populations of other competing carnivores, and how will that influence martens? Again, that was sort of the overall theme, right, of this talk, is how these other carnivores are influencing martens. So how will these climate and land use changes influence those populations, which will ultimately influence martens? Although winters are expected to become milder, how will the frequency and intensity of lake effect snowstorms influence martens? So again, a lot of uncertainty with that. If snowpack truly is the biggest driver in this system, then those more intense and more frequent lake effect snowstorms could be a game changer. Although, there's this whole other, question about freeze thaw cycles and, ice formation on the top of the snow and how that can facilitate movements of some of these larger carnivores. So again, a lot of uncertainties there. How could this disruption of mass cycles, possibly through new diseases like beech leaf disease, alter dispersal dynamics of martens? And I showed you sort of some of the mechanisms involved with that. And then are the structural attributes of these Tug Hill forests adequate for the long-term persistence of marten populations? I think I covered that one before. So I think actually that was those are two repeats there. But that's all I have to say with that. I just want to say that tons of people involved with this work over the years, and there's no way I can cover everyone here, but many great partners with DEC, great university partners, landowners, conservation easement holders. None of this work could have been possible without all the great cooperation and collaboration that I've had over the years, and the support of the agency that I work for. So I am going to just give you a real quick overview of an effort that I'm involved with SUNY ESF and Paul Smith's college that I think could be useful for future monitoring of not only martens, but other wildlife populations, and specifically within some of these landscape linkages. And again, I'm just going to whiz through this because I want to leave some time for questions. But we have an overriding framework. We're involved with inventorying, doing some basic inventory for species where we have little data, monitoring focal species that are sensitive to climate change. So species like marten, like bobcat, snowshoe hare, fishers, moose, weasels. We're interested in monitoring species associated with boreal forests. We're interested in sharing data with agencies that are responsible for managing or monitoring these species. And we're very interested in how wildlife are using some of these important landscape linkages. Again, many partners, both in New York State and across the Northeast, universities, biological field stations, many of these partners that are volunteering time and students and materials to conduct this work. We're using an established protocol that was developed by a colleague of mine from University of New Hampshire. And we're basically using some of the similar techniques. We're using camera traps, but we're also using snow stakes to simultaneously monitor snowpack conditions, as well as data loggers. So this right here is holding what's called a small I button, which is logging temperature. And so again, now that you've kind of been through this presentation, you understand a little bit better the importance of some of these abiotic conditions like snowpack, like temperature, and how they can influence some of the species that we're concerned with. These methods have really high cumulative detection probabilities, so we leave them out for long periods of time. They're not baited. They do have a lure that attracts species into that site. And after about 20 to 30 weeks, the probability of detecting many of these species is approaching 1, and certainly at 30 weeks it is. So if they're there, we will detect them with these methods, everything from red squirrels to moose. And then lots of partners spread across this region. We're trying to spend some more time in the Tug Hill region, and also we're attempting to put more effort into collecting data within some of these important linkages, like the Tug Hill Adirondack linkage, the linkage over here between the Green Mountains and the Adirondacks, as well as the linkage between the Adirondacks and Algonquin Park, which is further up here. We're partnering with some of these individuals, and we're also doing this work at a larger scale in the Northeast. There's another wildlife monitoring network that we're a part of, with close to 1,000 cameras spread throughout the northeastern US. We currently have about 1,000 camera traps out across this landscape, with both not only state partners, but federal partners as well. And again, these linkages. And then just quickly, some closing photos here for your viewing pleasure. Lots of bears, red fox, fishers, moose, snowshoe hare, fisher, marten, and that's it. I appreciate your patience. I hope you learned a lot. I know this was a whirlwind tour, but I have really as much time as you want to spend with questions. I'm here. If you're interested in partnering with this effort with ESF, there's the email address. You can contact somebody that will get back to you, and also check us out on social media. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. It was very, very, very interesting. We do have a couple of questions. First off, would a program to relocate some martens to the Tug Hill be of any value?
Yeah, I was anticipating this question. It could be, although right now, when I look at the data that we have in hand, it seems like dispersal is occurring. And, one might make the argument that, well, they're not really getting past the southwestern Adirondacks. In some cases they are, but in most cases they're not, at least from the data we have, getting further than that. So the question is why? And again, obviously these are trap martens. The trapping pressure really is not what is preventing those animals from dispersing either. It's because the trapping is really just occurring. It's a snapshot. It's a sample of what's occurring on the landscape. So what those locations that you see there are reflective of something that's occurring at a much larger scale. And so based upon those data, again, I feel like it's the predator population that's limiting their continued dispersal. But then they do sort of hit that wall where force composition on the landscape, or excuse me, the connectivity on the landscape isn't conducive. And I think that's really what they're hitting, that wall of force conditions aren't correct, and there's lots of predators in that area. But we are seeing some move out further than that. And so I think it's going to be the right conditions under which martens will get onto Tug Hill proper. Could some sort of augmentation speed that? I think it could. It possibly could. But again, that's something that the department would really have to weigh out the costs and benefits of doing that. The analog for wildlife is that we kind of had that similar decision to make with moose. Back in the 1980s, there was a proposal to augment our moose population, and ultimately that got rejected in favor of natural recolonization. And so I think if martens continue to disperse out of the southwestern Adirondacks, again, I think it's just a matter of time before they get onto Tug Hill. The question is, will they survive? But as far as the question of the augmentation, that's really a decision that needs to be made by current fur bear biologists and managers in terms of is the juice worth the squeeze on that.
Great, thank you. Then one last question, and then I'll leave everyone with a little closing information. I think you've answered a large portion of this, but the question is, can you hypothesize why the juveniles that make it to Tug Hill aren't surviving? Is it predation, lack of food resources, or wrong type of habitat?
I think it's primarily the fact that once you get into that region between the Adirondacks and Tug Hill, and I think this would be the very similar situation on the Tug Hill, you have a much more diverse carnivore community. So it's not that the forest conditions are limiting. It's not that prey is limiting. In fact, it's probably just the opposite. Prey abundance and prey diversity are probably higher on the Tug Hill and in that intervening area than they are in the central Adirondacks. So what that does is that more diverse prey base, as well as the milder winter conditions, even though it's probably deeper snowpack, right? But overall milder winter conditions, those two things positively influence all these other carnivore species: fisher, coyote, bobcat, fox. And all of these species directly compete with martens for food, and they prey on them. So if a coyote or a fisher or a fox detects a marten, it's going to try to kill it. And so those two things in combination basically suppress marten populations to the point where populations really can't persist over time. So that is a key takeaway from this talk, is that martens are the superior competitor in environment, in very harsh, low productivity environments. So places that have very low temperature, that also have deep snowpack, that also have very mature forests. So these low productivity systems have not only decreased prey diversity, but decreased prey abundance. And the prey that is there in the winter is covered by 3 or 4 feet of snow, which, by the way, martens can exploit that, the other carnivores can't. So them being a specialist in that respect and being able to survive and exploit these low productivity systems allows their population to escape the predation of all these other generalist carnivores. And it's not that these other generalist carnivores aren't there. They are there. It's just that their population density is much lower than in the areas surrounding the Adirondacks.
Great, thank you. With that, we're about to time, so I'll just remind everyone that you'll get a follow-up email following this webinar, and it'll have a link to the recording of the webinar on YouTube and all of Tug Hill Commission's past webinars as well. And it'll also have an invitation to register for the next webinar. And even if you're not able to attend the webinar, you should still register if it's something that interests you, because you'll get the invitation and then be able to view the recording afterwards. So again, that's March 12th at 6 p.m. That's on Tug Hill Birds with former DC staff and Tug Hill Tomorrow Land Trust. And Paul, unless you have anything else to add, I'll just like to thank you again. We really appreciate the partnership with DC and yourself. And I hope that everyone leaves with a new understanding and appreciation and knowledge for some of the wildlife we have here on Tug Hill and Adirondacks.
Thank you, Gabriel. And again, apologies, I went a little long. I hope you all learned a lot, and feel free to reach out to me either, primarily through my DEC contact there. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer any follow-up questions that you may have.
Wonderful. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks again, Gabriel.